So we all know the bird is kind of busted. It's the main story for Modern Horizons that just keeps on giving. And Wizards of the Coast aren't really planning to fix it until late in August. Again, I've got a whole video on that from last week. But one of the other stories coming out of Modern Horizons 3 is just how much it transformed Historic, Modern, and to a lesser extent Legacy overnight. At the Pro Tour, the vast majority of decks that existed prior to Modern Horizons 3 were pushed to the wayside. They were rogue decks that made up less than 1 to 2% of the metagame. This meant that Modern Horizons 3 brought with it not only new cards that were stronger than older things, but new archetypes that were stronger than older things. I stupidly, in a lot of my preview videos leading up to Modern Horizons 3, talked about how I thought like Amped Raptor might see play in a low to the ground sort of aggro Jund list, using your conventional Jund cards plus Amped Raptor. What I didn't realize at the time, or didn't foresee coming, was that there's no low to the ground Jund deck. It's just a load of new Modern Horizons cards that are the shell for the new Modern Horizons cards. In the grimdark future of 2024, there is only Modern Horizons. So Modern has rotated, and everything is now Modern Horizons. Same with Historic too, with Modern Horizons red-white energy deck being the most prominent and powerful thing you can do in that format. In today's video, I want to pick apart the idea of the energy deck in particular, of the archetype or the engine or the package that they gave us, and how it's just too good, and how it leads to boring and stagnant metagames, as well as being a failed design in a way. I want to talk about how these cards are bad game design. But before we jump into that, do you want to win some of these in a giveaway? Do you want to buy some of these off me, the boosters? And I'll open them live on camera and I'll sign some of them for you. That's what whatnot.com offers you. It's a live streaming service that also has sales built in. It's like eBay meets Twitch. And people like myself, we're on there doing the whole thing of live streaming the product stuff. This Friday at 7:30 p.m. BST, I'll put a link to in the description below to the show. I'll be doing my Bloomburrow show. We'll have boosties for sale, boosties to give away. I'm gonna drop the box now. That's it, all the cards are broken now. But I'll be doing all of that on whatnot.com. Use the link in the description below to get £10 off your first purchase. If you buy something at auction off and buy it now in my shop, you get £10 off your first purchase, and it helps to support the show because I get a kickback too. I'll see you on Whatnot this Friday. In Modern right now, there are a few decks that are using the energy package. There is Jeskai Control, which I'll put on screen now. This is a slower deck that looks to play 4 copies of the One Ring. Basically, it's like, do you want to play the One Ring? Sure. So what's your best like answers? Well, it's this whole package of energy cards, including Tune the Narrative, a cantrip that creates energy, a Galvanic Discharge, a power crept version of Harnessed Lightning. If you want to go a bit faster and you're happy not to play the One Ring, you can play the aggro deck, which is called Red-White Energy or Boros Energy, which plays a load of energy cards, including Guide of Souls as one of the engine cards. Everybody you play gives you an energy and life, and you can use that energy to make your creatures fly and be more evasive, whilst you just pommel your opponent aggressively. Interestingly enough, this deck has even more Modern Horizons stuff in it. Ajani Nakatl Pariah features heavily as a 4 in all of the red-white energy decks. Ocelot Pride, a card that everyone told me was bad during previous season, but I said it couldn't possibly be bad. Look at all the rules text on it. This card sees play because it basically synergizes with Guide of Souls. That's the only reason it sees play. And then at the Pro Tour, a lot of decks weren't playing Ragavan, I believe. But more recently, this 7-1 list from SCG over the weekend, the RCQ at SCG Con Baltimore, is playing Ragavan. They've seen sense. Ragavan is good in a red-white aggro deck. And Flage is everywhere too. Being seen playing both the decks I just mentioned, and Jeskai Control, because it's a card that can help you grind out the game and is good in 2 different modes. Its early mode as a removal spell, its later mode as a creature. And in the Boros deck, it relies on it more as a removal spell, but it's good to have the creature later on as well. And then more recently, there's a Fringe deck. There's a 6-3 at Baltimore, which is Mardu Energy, which is the aggro deck I just mentioned, except it's playing some black spells. Weirdly, Obnixilus the Adversary, a card from Streets of New Capenna that everyone thought was bad, and I still thought was bad, is seeing play. The traditional Thoughtseizers, of course, are in there as their interaction spell. And then primarily, the main black splash, other than those 2 cards, is Chthonian Nightmare, a fixed recurring nightmare that allows you to do an attrition game plan that is fixed by adding energy to it. And like I said, there's also a Historic deck too, which I'm not going to go into too much detail. I just know they're dominating right now because I don't play much Historic at the moment. I tend to play Timeless or Brawl when I log onto the Arena client. So Energy was brought back in Modern Horizons 3 in an attempt to give it a new second chance, a new lease of life. It was originally in the Kaladesh block, and it was quite a good deck in Standard, to the point that it actually had a card banned. Attune with Aether and Rogue of Viner were both banned to weaken the energy deck in Standard, but they never really made their way into Modern like a lot of banned cards would, right? Normally when a card is good, it will make its way into some sort of eternal format, non-rotating format. That wasn't the case here. The energy deck was good or too good for standard. It wasn't good enough to hit modern. But the mechanic was reasonably popular, and Wizards wanted to go back to it at some point to make it stronger for Commander, and especially they want to give it new lease of life there. You see, there's a lot of older mechanics. There'll be a point where Wizards of the Coast are like, we need to give the players who like this some way to play in the super casual realm where you can experiment a little bit, which is Commander. So we saw an energy deck come back and do that this time around. We also saw energy come back in Fallout as well, but they also wanted to try and make it competitive in Modern. The interesting thing about making it competitive in Modern is that none, and I mean none, of the original Kaladesh cards, well, actually that's not true. There's one, I'll come to that in a moment, but none barring one see any play in the Eternal formats. They didn't make energy good, they just printed a whole swath of cards that were just good or too good for Modern, or better than other things in Modern, should I say. Too good is an interesting turn of phrase. That's a value judgment. I think they, shouldn't be in the format, but they're better than most things. That's why the energy decks are prominent, and at the moment getting beaten out by Nardu and Ruby Storm and similar, but they're prominent in the metagame anyway, because the cards that use the energy from Modern Horizons 3 are just better than a lot of old Modern Horizons cards. Static Prison, for example, is incredibly versatile. It's time sensitive if you don't have a big pool of energy, but the decks that are playing energy will get more energy anyway, and if you're not, or you struggle, have the wrong draw, you're still removing that thing for 2 turns, which might be enough for you to aggro them out. Aether Hub is the only card from the original Kaladesh block that I've seen see any play in the modern energy decks, because it's a piece of mana fixing that creates your energy off your land. It's like a free spell, essentially, getting you that 1 extra pip of energy. I guess some of you might be wondering what energy does. Energy is a finite pool of resources that you generate from cards. Cards often generate it and use it. That's a common trend for energy. There are exceptions. I'm going to talk about one of those in a moment, but that stops it from being what's called parasitic. The fact that it makes the energy and can use it means that that card can function outside of its home environment. You don't need energy enablers and creators and energy be payoffs. You don't need both parts of the puzzle to get there. This is something that they struggled with in the past. The original Kamigawa block was an example of parasitic design by Wizards' own admission, where certain cards, like things with arcane on them, didn't do anything special or unique or different, or just didn't do anything outside of the sets or environments where the arcane mechanic existed. This meant that when other mechanics and sets came along, this got forgotten or not used. The way to avoid this is to make your cards just do things on their own, or to make the mechanics less inward looking. For example, a card that says when it has a counter on it, it does a thing, like here's an example, Abzan Valkana. It does Outlast. Outlast is a mechanic in the set, but it also does something with creatures that already have counters on them or could have counters on them, and thus has an application outside of its original limited set. Abzan Valkana is a card that I love, and I wish I could play it more. I've tried accompanying into it before, but anyway, that's not what this video is about. But here's Abzan Valkana. What a card. But the bit that really bugs me was that instead of going back and making cards that just made a lot more energy, let's say, to make the energy cards perhaps better, that's pretty a hard thing to really balance as well. They instead just made cards that are better than the original energy cards. So the original mechanic kind of didn't really do anything new or get a new lease of life. Instead, we just got energy 2.0 in a sense. It is strictly speaking energy. So in a format like Commander or Brawl, you will play with the older cards because you want a critical mass of singleton cards that care about energy. But ultimately, the old cards just aren't good enough, and nothing made them better. It was just a case of the old mechanic being put onto much better new cards. Now, that isn't inherently its own issue. The issue I have in terms of making this a bad bit of design, and there's some good things too, which I'm going to say once I get this point out in the open, is that the energy cards are just their own archetype and their own deck handed to us on a plate by Wizards of the Coast. We are given 3, 4, or 5 different cards to play a playset of in a deck that just does the energy thing better than any others, does the thing they do better than any others. And thus, because they synergize so strongly together with this mechanic, that's an archetype, that's a deck. It's almost like they've given us a pre-constructed energy deck that you can then tune either way, faster or slower, control or aggro. But instead of giving us that precon deck in a way that you can buy in a precon package that we understand, a precon is normally something you buy off a shelf, like the Commander decks for Warhammer, for example. Instead, it's pre-constructed within the packs that you can go out and buy and hopefully random your way into getting enough playsets to play the stuff, or burn your wild cards on Arena. Like Wrath of the Skies, as an example of a power creep magic card, is a card that sees more play in the control deck in the main deck. I guess the aggro decks can play it in their sideboards if they need access to it, but ultimately it is part of the red, white, and blue energy control deck in Modern. And this card on preview, the fact that it just creates X energy that you can pay into, people were already like, wow, This Wrath then allows you to pay energy and destroy each artifact, creature, and enchantment with mana value equal to the energy you've paid into it, and it's an X spell, so you can get as much energy as you have available mana. People are like, this card's so good, it might just see play, and probably will still see play in the future in other decks in Modern and Legacy, just as a way to blow up artifacts, enchantments, and creatures that doesn't depend upon the shell of energy. It's independently so fucking good that when you put it into an energy shell with other cards that make more energy, it goes from good to cracked. Galvanic Discharge is quite literally harness the lightning, but with extra claws, being able to hit planeswalkers, not just creatures, and 1 less mana. It is strictly better than the removal spell version that we saw in original Energy when we saw. An Amped Raptor is an interesting Magic card like on its own because it's a 2 mana 2/1 that gives you 2 energy, and if you cast from hand, you trigger reveal cost to your library until you hit it on land, and you can cast that spell by paying energy instead of paying mana. And thus, it's a 2 mana Blood-Red Elf that can hit. It can whiff by hitting a non-2. So if you build your deck around only having 2 CMC spells, you will always be able to hit with it. And that's where I thought this card would go, until we got the rest of the package. The Soul Sister, that is a strictly better version of Soul Sisters. It's a 1/2 compared to previous 1/1s, that generate you a life and an energy when things enter. That's already just strictly better than most Soul Sisters we've seen before. But then, it also allows you to dump your energy into making your creatures like fly and get 2 counters. This card is so unbelievably pushed in terms of the amount of text they put on it to make it viable in Modern. It's kind of dumb. So once you have this, like the enablers plus the payoffs like Amped Raptor, they go from being independently powerful again to just being incredibly powerful shells. Collections of cards that you're just going to play together anyway. And the thing is, it kind of extends beyond the energy thing, right? Both decks are playing Flage, which is just a very, very powerful red-white mythic. This Titan is incredible. It's good in burn, but it's also really, really good against burn. It's good in general. Lightning Helixing and then getting a 6/6 body later on that Lightning Helixes again for the low cost of 3 and 4 mana with some escape is bonkers. The Titans like Uro and Krogsa were really good anyway, and Uro being banned in Modern. So this space was ripe to explore for finding a new mythic that you can push out the door that everyone will want access to if they want to play these colors in this format. So really this extends beyond just like red-white energy. It's also like red-white super staples. Your Ragavans, your Flages, your Furies were not banned, and your Solitudes, which are also see play in the control deck. It gives you just a package of shit to play, and it removes a lot of innovation and style and experimentation that comes with having a large, wide collected card pool of everything Magic has to offer in the past. Modern spans all the way from 8th edition, and Legacy spans since the dawn of the game, yet they are both dominated by Modern Horizons cards. The other irony is that this new Modern design stability dominating these formats is why we're getting Guide of Souls via 1/2. If this was a 1/1, it just dies to Orcish Bowmasters, a card from Lord of the Rings, which is like the middle ground, Modern Horizons 2.5, right? Its power level was lower than Modern Horizons on the whole, and I actually think that maybe Lord of the Rings is where we want the power level to be, but the existence of just this card in the One Ring warps design of cards in future, and X1 is not viable unless it has all the text of Ragavan, and even then that's probably not good enough in a world of Orcish Bowmasters. It's a metagame call, and thus new 1-drops have to be 1/2s to be viable, which is fucking stupid. There's this concept in video game design, I guess it works for board games and tabletop too, called emergent gameplay. The idea of emergent gameplay is that you make basic systems. It's kind of similar to how immersive Sims work, if you're aware of that concept. The idea that the systems in the game allow you to experiment and innovate. It stops you being on rails and doing the set pieces or the structured narrative that the game designers have given you, but instead allow you to utilize the mechanics within the game to experiment and do new things. One example I like to go to with this is the Battlefield games. They're open sandboxes to an extent instead of your more enclosed arena shooters, or arena shooters that have transformed into military shooters like Call of Duty, which then became an open warfare Warzone thing. Anyway, back to Battlefield. I'm old. I'm talking about like the original iterations of those games. In Battlefield 1942 and its successors, there were just weird things that people would do that the development team never expected. The obvious stuff is like using your plane that you're flying as a battering ram to crash it into a fortification and blow up an anti-aircraft gun or a tank or similar. That's the thing that people did in real wars, if I'm honest, not to make light of that kind of situation. So that wasn't that unique. But something that came up was putting, I forget whether it was 1942 and put them on Jeeps or whether it's a bit later with like Bad Company and such, but putting C4 onto a buggy and then driving the buggy as fast as possible or off of a jump into an enemy encampment, into the base that's being defended, into where the bomb site you got to put the bomb on. Sometimes crashing it into the building where the bomb is. And then you set off the C4, killing the person on it, or if you've got off of it, you've got off of it, blowing up the building and opening it wide up to then allow the enemy team to shoot at it with tanks and similar, or get into it easier. Creating your own traveling bomb by strapping C4 to a vehicle was not something that was designed as an explicit design purpose for the game. Like, it's there, you can stick C4 C4 to literally anything. The whole point is you stick C4 to an enemy piece of armor and blow it up, right? That's the whole point of them being sticky. You stick them on the underside if they roll over you and stuff. Anyway, the point is, players found new things to do with those mechanics, and it was wonderful. We saw it in Baldur's Gate 3 recently, where people were making huge stacks of boxes, transforming into an owlbear, jumping off the top of it because owlbears take no fall damage, and then essentially elbow dropping off of huge amounts of fall damage onto enemy bosses to do huge damage and kill bosses when they shouldn't be able to, off of stacks of wooden boxes. People were putting lots of explosives into chests, strengthening themselves up, put the chest in your pocket, and then throw the chest at the enemy, hit with a fireball. Bada boom, you've made your own nuke. I believe Baldur's Gate actually patched those two instances out because they're abuse of the systems that are already there. They're so far from intended that they're actually not quite how the developers want you to play the game. The point to these anecdotes that I'm going on about is that emergent gameplay is something that I respect and love in video games. I love when they are open sandboxes for you to experiment in and do new things in. It creates innovation and exciting hype where people find new things that other people haven't. You get to have those communal moments where we all share on social media, or you tell your friend or show them a clip of someone doing something truly unique in a video game. And Magic has always had that emergent element be part of its older formats. With Legacy and Modern, you have card pools of tens of thousands of cards. And sometimes it takes a while for people to find out that Death Shadow is actually kind of cracked when you lower your life total off Shocklands and Fetchlands. Death Shadow is probably the best example of this. It was a card that existed for a long time in meme status, and eventually someone was like, actually, I think I can make a Delver deck out of this, and bang, it became a dominant threat in certain metagames over the years in both Modern and Legacy. And that was through time, innovation, ingenuity of the player base. It wasn't handed to us with an archetype of cards that tell you what to do. They're like, make energy, do energy things. That's kind of dumb and I hate it. Instead of creating content to be consumed and set pieces to see once and then move on from and get bored with, like we're kind of seeing right now with Nardu and other decks just dominating a ton of formats, you instead create a rich tapestry of Magic that allows you to brew and shift and do new things in, to innovate in that space. But the problem is that, well, Magic itself has a little bit of antithesis to this. It's got a little bit of inbuilt friction with this idea around limited formats, and then Modern Horizons is that to an absolute extreme. For example, I actually have a feeling that some of these energy cards like Galvanic Discharge, for example, I said it for example twice there, I'm going to say it a third time, fourth time actually. For example, Galvanic Discharge. I think this card was a limited card. I don't think that anyone at Wizards of the Coast thought that this card would see much constructed play because they hadn't really factored into the fact that the rest of the energy package was so damn good. And when they create new mechanics, Forage or this or Offspring or whatever, you often find them making cards that pay off from it in the limited environments that when you draft, you can find the signpost energy card and then build into it with the other stuff. And the way they signposted the energy this time round was with fixing older broken cards, which is not a good way to make sure your new mechanic isn't broken. But before we go on to that final point, this is the friction in Magic, is that every new mechanic will have supporting pieces in limited. And normally a lot of the supporting pieces are just good for limited, and they don't just give us the absolute like framework to build a constructed deck out of. That still takes some ingenuity at least. Standard, you see this a bit more perhaps. But then when you take Modern Horizons, where all the cards are pushed to an extreme, every card in the set is fighting to be as powerful as the others, and thus these draft archetypes just come out of the gate being the best archetypal thing to do in aggro or control for the modern format, which is absolutely fucking bonkers when you say it out loud. And lastly, just talk about Chthonian Nightmares for a second. Chthonian Nightmares is a fixed version of Recurring Nightmare. There's a lot of ways it's fixed in terms of timing. There's a trigger when ATBs to get the energy so you can interact with it, where Recurring Nightmare is famously very hard to interact with, because once it's resolved, the controlling player can then activate it before anyone else at the table has any priority to interact with it. Recurring Nightmare was fixed significantly with Chthonian Nightmare, but Chthonian Nightmare is still pretty good. It turns out like when you take cards that were already busted as fuck, and you try, in this case, and rather elegantly I guess, give it fixes for its old things, like making it interactable, for example, you're still playing with fire. The funniest part about this to me is that Recurring Nightmare was 3 mana, and the fixed version that's meant to be less broken, they still had to bring it down a mana to make sure that it's, you know, playable in Modern, because that's the point, right? Everything's got to be playable in Modern and Modern Horizons, or the vast majority has to be. Although, to be fair, there's another example of this with Primal Prayers being the fixed version of Allurin, And whilst it's a good, fun card that you can do things with, it's not quite actually alluring, which is a combo deck in Legacy. And thus, not every fixed energy version of old broken cards were as broken as their counterparts, or as playable as their counterparts, should we say. So I don't want to just cherry pick the Chthonian Nightmare example, but it's just another layer on top of why energy as a mechanical identity in Modern Horizons 3 is kind of annoying to look back on. And then lastly, there is just one example of the energy mechanic being used in a truly parasitic way. So I mentioned earlier about how all of the energy cards both generate the energy and do the thing, and then sometimes you have to like do a little bit of work to get there. Chthonian Nightmares, for example, you do have to like, if you want to play back big things like you would with Recurring Nightmare, you got to like do little things first, keep putting it back into your hand and generating more energy, or make energy off of other cards to power this up. That's kind of how energy works, right? But is it Genitorium, a 2-mana, red-blue, uncommon? It's a draft archetypal signpost card, right? It's to make you in the energy archetype. But it says if you get 1 or more energy, you get that many energy instead, and tap, draw a card, activate only if you paid or lost 4 or more energy this turn. This card does absolutely nothing if you have no other cards that create energy in your deck, which I think is fascinating because they avoid this so much, but there's a sprinkle of it here and there. And in some ways, it actually makes me think maybe if more cards were like this, where they did absolutely fuck all outside the energy archetype, maybe, just maybe, they wouldn't be best in class in Modern and Historic. I did mention there were some good things about energy in Modern Horizons 3, and namely it's that, like, whilst I think the prescriptive nature of it all that I'm coming to with this, the idea of them just giving us a selection of cards that are the best way to play this archetype and there's no innovation in that, that is bad. I must admit that the engine mechanics that they gave us were really, really fun. Like, there was just a very... It's hard to put my finger on how to explain it, but everything feels very satisfying about playing a Guide of Souls and then hitting an energy creature afterwards, building your energy pool, and then you draw your payoff for that, whether this being constructed or limited. All of these things are super exciting and super fun, so they got the feel right. The idea of creating this engine that does more and more as you go on, a Rube Goldberg machine of nonsense. I really enjoyed it in the Fallout energy deck as well, although some of the cards there were perhaps a little restrictive in what they do, being once per turn or only once per combat, for example, with the Robot Conveyor Belt card. Either way, I think they keep making the energy cards fun. More fun than they were in Kaladesh, if I'm honest. I was never really enamored by energy originally. This is much more interesting and cool and exciting. So yeah, there's the positive. There's the silver lining to this shit. It's going to be a shit sandwich. I'm going to give good, bad, good. But that's it, that's my main good one. Now back to the shit. So ultimately, I just don't like the idea of Wizards of the Coast giving us a package of cards that end up being the deck that you play. I love the idea of spreading out all of this power across the entirety of Magic's history and giving players space to innovate and create these emergent gameplay elements. I don't like it being prescribed to me as basically a pre-con, but I've got to open it through the gambling of booster packs. Let me know what you think in the comment section below. It's just something I've been thinking about quite a bit, so I want to make a video on. And I'll see you in the next one. Don't forget to check out my show on whatnot.com for the links in the description below. I'll see you soon. Ta for now.